what you would essentially be seeing in the formation of the first life is a psychokinetic effect on raw materials that then brings them into a vastly improbable form.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mind Matters. Over the past few weeks, we have been discussing intelligent design, the Holy Grail, cometary bombardment, all sorts of mysterious and interesting things that happen on this planet over millennia that are not discussed whatsoever in the mainstream. So we thought that since we're so interested in all of it, we would just start. We were just planning on doing one show, and then after every show so far, we've said, oh, there's this topic, this subject. We could go into this. And so this week, we're going to continue based on some very interesting insights that Harrison has had, that all of us have had regarding the influence of parapsychology or Psi phenomenon and other related interesting esoteric phenomenon on the potential role that they play in intelligent design, evolution, and trying to get an idea for, as Harrison calls it, where intelligence designs, where the intelligence comes in and where the design comes in, and how everything that we've been discussing, from comets to being like furnaces for the creation of extraordinarily important genetic and pre-genetic and all different sorts of material, and how that all works. You know, there's so many different theories out there, and so many different individuals, brilliant individuals, have different pieces of the puzzle. So we're going to just keep on kind of putting those puzzle pieces together and having fun. We hope that you have fun with it as well. So Harrison, did you have something in mind with where you wanted to go?
Well, I'll start out with a preface, because you mentioned that a lot of these topics aren't talked about in the mainstream at all. And because we're not mainstream, that means we can talk about all of them. I read something today that kind of brought this dynamic out for me. There's this philosopher, academic philosopher, that's just published a paper, or will be publishing a paper. I think it's out already. A critique of evolutionary psychology. And because evolutionary psychology is big, it's kind of like an accepted thing. Everyone likes it. And so she wrote this paper just kind of critiquing it at the very foundation, basically implying, if not outright stating, but she might also do that it's just totally bunk from the bottom up. And most scholars, most academics, well, many can get away with something like that, with stepping out of the mainstream and either critiquing something or coming up with a wacky, crazy theory, that might just happen to be true. But when you look at anyone who does have an established career, usually they won't go that far. They won't push any boundaries, and they'll stay within the limits of their profession and the accepted bounds of the range of discourse possible within any kind of system like that. Then you get the few that stray outside and will have kind of one crazy, wacky idea, right? And they've done the research. They really are convinced that there's something to it. Mm-hmm. So that enables them to go forward and to risk the approbation of their peers and the hate and the smears that they will get as a result of it, because they feel it's the truth. So it's their job to go forward and do it. But what you often find in every field, there is someone like that. Mm-hmm. It's easy to miss. It's easy not to realize that within every field there is a black sheep, there is a maverick, or just a courageous individual that sees a problem and then points it out, or sees a problem with an entire field or something at the very foundation of some accepted worldview or theory or whatever. And that you've got these people in every field, and oftentimes when you read things, even in this current climate, when the idea of scientific authority is kind of at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, and you'll often see statements like "the experts agree" or "everyone agrees with this." It's never true. There are always a minority of varying, it might be a tiny minority or a small minority or a substantial minority of people of experts who disagree.
Mm-hmm.
And that nothing is ever that simple. You'll only find consensus in a group of people, and it's usually around some kind of general, something very general, like an overall theory. You'll get a general consensus among most biologists that Darwinism is the answer, that random mutation and natural selection answer all the questions. When you get into all of the details, most people disagree. You won't often find a total consensus on every scientific result. And I mean, scientific debate can be quite contentious and combative within those fields. And then scientists themselves can be quite snipey at each other and quite kind of backstabbing and petty. It's pretty common. But coming back to this idea of these rogues in these fields, oftentimes they just have one idea. They're just rogue on one idea. Mm-hmm. Now, when you add all of them together, then you've got like the anti-worldview of the mainstream scientific establishment, because you've got this one over here that's opposite this idea or that directly contradicts it, this one over here, this one over here. Well, what if we just got rid of that entire circle of the mainstream accepted academic view of the world and took all of the ones on the boundaries? What would that world look like? And I mean, it's not like we plan to do that on the outset, but that's probably a picture of kind of where we're at. Mm-hmm. When it comes to most mainstream things, we have found ourselves taking the road less traveled, let's say. And so today we're just going to be mashing a bunch of those ideas together. We started last week, and just to give a summary of some of the relevant ideas for last week, so that you don't have to watch that show if you haven't, but we encourage you.
But of course you should. Why wouldn't
you? We were talking about comets and, like you said, the prebiotic and like biological material found in various types of space matter. Mm-hmm. And one idea that was I think we kind of briefly alluded to it in the last show, but never really got into it in detail, is an idea that has been presented by another black sheep maverick, Jim McCanney, in some of his self-published books on comets and kind of his electrical universe type theory on the nature of comets. And one of the ideas he presents, which I think is interesting, I don't know if it's the total answer yet. I don't know if I don't know. Well, I'm not familiar with all the evidence he uses to support it. Like I know from just recently listening to some Randall Carlson stuff that they've done various spectro something analyses of spectrometric, I don't know, of comet comas and like the presence of certain kind of organic chemistry in space rocks of these sorts. What McCanney suggests is that the coma of a comet is actually basically electrically ignited. It's like burning plasma, and within that kind of electrically charged environment that lights up the sky so dramatically, and often to like millions of size the actual cometary body on the inside, the coma can be like as big as the sun for a body like a comet that's relatively tiny in comparison. That area right behind the comet is almost like you described, like a furnace, like a chemical factory of some sort, where weird stuff happens, because in this type of plasma, it's the way I see it is it's almost like it's almost like a natural random number generator. Like there's random processes going on in this this plasma mix of protons and electrons, and then all the other materials that kind of become part of this, like the gas cloud of this comet. And I suspect weird stuff can happen in that kind of environment where it almost, the way I picture it, now this is totally unscientific, but the way I picture it is almost like in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, what's their spaceship called? The Zaphod Beeblebrox's. It's the improbability drive of the whatever the name of the spaceship is. It's like weird, improbable things can happen in a random environment. Because one of the things we were talking about last week is that in the history of evolution, it seems like there's these punctuated or these punctuations in the evolutionary history where, you know, things are pretty boring and routine for a while, and then there's, you know, something amazing happens, and either an extinction or an explosion or a mass extinction or an explosion of new life forms like in the Cambrian. And it seems like I don't think anyone has yet come up with a good explanation for why the history of all species, of the history of life on this planet is like that. According to just basic Darwinism, it should be a relatively stable growth, or, you know, evolution, or devolution. You know, we should be getting successively dumber and less evolved. Well, you'd think it would be one or the other, but instead it's these rapid, you know, catastrophic changes one way or the other. So it seems that what you would need, or it seems that if that's the case, that something special would have happened in these special times to kind of bring about these rapid and you know, grand changes. So what we were talking about last week is that you need basically, you know, a specific context, you need materials, and then you need like the right specific environment going on, like a momentary environment. This might be the EM burst from a fireball or a cometary impact, just where the chemical nature of the environment changes so rapidly and to such a large degree and so strangely, to something so out of the ordinary that something new is then possible for whatever reason. So maybe there's something about like the electromagnetic signature of these events that allows things to happen. And I think we described that as kind of like a window. It's like a weird something when you change something to that degree, so out of the ordinary, that then that is where new stuff happens, because that's the new environment. Maybe that is the context necessary for this type of change to occur. Something to do with electromagnetics, perhaps, and just the new environment caused by these extreme events, these epic catastrophes, or whatever the opposite of a catastrophe would be. So something like that might be happening in comet tails, where it might actually generate certain of these materials, like to form amino acids or some other type of prebiotic material essential for the formation of life. It might not be that it just was on some planet, gets picked up, gets ejected from some bombardment there into space, and then hitches a ride to another solar system. It might be that some of these are actually generated in space, in comet comas. Just like, well, not just like, but similar to how stars, the formation of stars generate, you know, the first 26 elements of the periodic table. Something similar might be going on a higher level of chemistry, actually putting those building blocks together in pretty basic forms. But well, maybe not. That's just an idea that pops into head after reading some of Jim McCanney's stuff and, you know, tying it into a few other things. But I guess, so one idea to add into the mix. It doesn't necessarily have to be the source, but it may be at least a possible source for some of the material needed for the origins of life, let's say.
Well, I seem to remember you mentioning something along the lines of like some quantum, that McCanney theorized that there was some quantum process that was occurring due to the sheer energy and everything, all the randomness and craziness going on, that that is where that window that we were talking about could kind of open, is when there's within the comet coma.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Well, it might be. It's been several years since I read McCanney, and I'm no physicist or chemist, so I can't remember if that was it. I can't remember the details and wouldn't be able to reproduce them. But I think that might be right. Is you know, some kind of, because there's going to be quantum stuff going on, just like there is everywhere at all times. But there might be a special environment in that case, in this kind of plasma, so that there is something on that level going on. But even just if we go outside of the realm of strict quantum mechanics to a bit more of the popularized version of it. It's like you can have a quantum effect that's similar to some of the actual quantum effects on that subatomic level that you see on a macro level, like you might see. A quantum effect as in like a rapid or an instantaneous shift in levels that's discontinuous, that doesn't go through the space in between. Essentially, you jump from one state to another state, kind of like a phase shift, but a phase shift not in terms of solid, liquid, and gas or plasma, but a shift in order, perhaps. A shift, because that's essentially what you see in a lot of atomic or subatomic processes, like electron orbitals. You see jumps, you see discontinuous phenomena where things aren't smooth and going from one to the other, like Darwinian evolution. Things come in jumps, in leaps. So that would be a good way of describing this hypothesized or theorized mechanism going on in comet tails, is that it's a place where quantum leaps are generated in the organization of basic chemistry, so that you might have a jump from the collection of raw materials into all of these amino acids, for instance. And it might look instantaneous when you observe it, but there's some weird stuff going on, and that actually relates to the question you asked that we were kind of puzzling over. Is like we discussed last week in terms of intelligent design. One of the things we brought up is that the intelligent design people only go so far, because they've got their own agenda or their own purpose. I don't say agenda in a like a mean way. It's like they've got their purpose, what they want to do. They want to present a good scientific theory for intelligent design. Basically, that the science, this is what the science suggests. We're not going any further than the science suggests. It's basically where we hypothesize that intelligence is necessary for the creation of information, whether that be in genetic information or body form, body plan information, or just any form of biological information. So that's as far as they go, but they stop at the level of, well, how that actually happens, or how that actually happened. What are some possibilities for how that might have actually occurred? Was it literally some physical being that had a lab and brewed up these life forms in their lab? Was it so similar to our environment? Are there lab technicians that are brewing up life forms, essentially? Or for some of the more religious ones, was it God himself or Jesus that did this? And if so, how? They don't go there because that's I guess an unscientific question. It's something that they don't really want to speculate on because, again, these are oftentimes scientists, biologists, biochemists that are within their field coming out with their one radical idea. And one radical idea is enough for anyone who's professional, because the more radical ideas you tag onto that, the less credibility you get, and the more haters you have, and the more attacks you have to fend off. So they'll just stick to one. Okay, this is our crazy idea. We're going to limit our craziness to this, and just kind of bracket off everything else. So I've never really seen anyone try to put some more ideas together and say, well, how actually would this happen? Because they've got the intelligent design people would have a good response to the idea of some alien lab technician brewing up life. It's like, okay, well, that doesn't really answer the question, because where did the alien lab technician come from? Well, fair enough. So it just pushes the question out there further back. But if there's something weirder going on, well, what would actually happen? So let's say you've got the planet Earth before any life forms are on it. What would it look like when the first single-celled organism appeared? Where does it come from? Did it drop from space? Did it just when observing that situation, what would appear? Would it just appear to come out of nowhere? Does it transmit or transfer from some other dimension? Like, what's going on there? So that's kind of one of the questions that we want to look at today is what is a possible, or how to phrase this? What is at least one possible factor that might be involved in that process? And that's where you brought it up earlier. The idea of psi or parapsychology comes into play. Now, it might seem like a leap, you know, if you're not familiar with a lot of these ideas, but to give a little background, one of the good arguments that Stephen Meyer, one of the intelligent design guys, puts forward is what he calls the inference to the best explanation. So he was looking for basically a way to formulate what the arguments he was making in the kind of the vague, maybe perhaps vague, unarticulated arguments he had at the time, or unarticulated just way of framing those arguments, trying to figure out what the best way to do that would be, trying to figure out the best way to do that within kind of known scientific practice. And this is what he came up with, because even Darwin himself and a lot of the geologists at the time, they have this idea of, well, and currently today too, this idea of scientific naturalism. And one of the premises of that, or one of the ways of arguing within that limited worldview, is what he calls the inference to the best explanation. If you're going to explain a phenomenon that is current in the present time, then the only real options you have are the causes that can bring that about in the present. So scientists can't very well hypothesize some strange new causal or old cosmic phenomena or causal phenomenon going on in the past that we are unaware of today, because we don't see it. We don't have any evidence that it actually exists. So what are the causal processes that we can see today that can explain what happened in the past? One example he gives, just for how this works on a kind of mundane level, is like fingerprint analysis. If you find a fingerprint and it matches some other guy's fingerprint, and that happened so something happened in the past, you find this fingerprint at a crime scene, the inference to the best explanation is that that fingerprint belonged to this guy, and either his thumb touched it or his thumb touched something that was then copied and planted on there in order to frame him. I mean, those are the two basic explanations. There's no other explanation for how that specific fingerprint got there. It didn't just appear out of nowhere, or maybe it did, but that's a whole other question. So you use the known causes, which is that guy's fingerprint, and the fact that fingers leave fingerprints, to explain that thing that happened in the past. So in terms of the creation and origin of information, Stephen Meyer argues, is that the only known cause that we have for the creation of new information is intelligence. Therefore, the origin of life and the origin of genetic and biological information must have been intelligence. So that's as far as he goes. And coming back to our mystery, as if that isn't a big enough mystery, is, okay, well, let's now assume that it is intelligence. Well, how does that intelligence operate on what? The matter in existence, the raw material, the stuff from comets, or the stuff that's just present on a planet that happens to be what's the best way to put it? Luckily, it happened to have a lot of luck in its component parts in order to have all of the material necessary for that leap, that quantum leap from the level of basic chemistry to biochemistry. So we can phrase the question, well, what is the only known cause or means of organizing matter, of bringing order to matter, of injecting information into matter that we know of? What is the only known cause that does that we know of, in the absence of a physical being actually doing so? And that's kind of a tricky question, because you have to. So, it might not.
It's controversial.
Yeah. Well, to just blurt it out there, the only known cause that we know of that does that is psychokinesis.
Mm-hmm.
So what is psychokinesis? Well, it's the action of a mind on matter without any physical means of affecting that matter, of having an effect on that matter. So this is why we said that we'll just take a whole bunch of controversial ideas not accepted by the mainstream and mash them all together, because arguably psychokinesis is a real phenomenon. I think that any serious scientist that has looked at it, that didn't have an agenda or an extreme bias, has come to the conclusion, or does come to the conclusion, that there is something real going on here.
Mm-hmm. And let me just interrupt you really quick. Just take a quick break from that, and just let the audience know that I think one of the best books that I've ever read on parapsychology was by Dr. James Carpenter's First Sight, because he goes through and he critically analyzes, decades worth of scientific studies on every different kind of, from telekinesis to psychokinesis. And he attempts to lay out an elaborate theory that's grounded in all of the available data that takes into account all of the data. And so for anyone out there who is wondering, well, that seems like kind of a leap, I would highly recommend getting that book, ordering that book, and reading it. And by the time that you're done with that, I think that the pieces of the puzzle will have clicked into place, and you'll really begin to see that, okay, yes, one of the controversial aspects of intelligent design is the nature of intelligence. And is intelligence only embodied in physical forms that are like the ones like you and your neighbor, and that the highest form of intelligence is basically getting your PhD in whatever.
Correct.
Yes. and that the answer is that's, well, that it's still controversial, but intelligence in and of itself seems to have a much broader and more fundamental existence in this universe, and that there are aspects to ourselves that we pick up on just on just daily human life. You get gut instinct, you get gut feelings, your gut tells you to do this. You're picking up information from places, and you're processing it in ways that is not just nuts and bolts, cause and effect, logical, and it's not just emotional, like limbic system based drives that are more or less animal in nature, but that there are higher intelligent drives as well. And so I would highly recommend reading that book, getting that book, and then I'll hand that back off to Harrison.
Well, we did the first two shows on our channel were on that book, on James Carpenter's show. So if you go to our videos on our channel and just scroll to the very bottom, those first two videos are on First Sight. So if you don't want to get the book, then watch the videos and then get the book, because you'll want to after that. There are a couple different approaches. Like James Carpenter in that book, he's a psychologist, so he is focusing on the parapsychological research, and like Corey said, he's got all of it in there. He probably cites every major and minor study that's been done on all these various phenomena over the decades. And research like this has been going on for over 100 years, maybe 150 years by now, from serious scientists. And then you get philosophers like Stephen Browdy, who has another kind of contemporary writer, who has several books, one specifically on psychokinesis. If you just search Stephen Browdy, I believe PH, and his last name's Braude, he's got good work on that too. And then there's guys like Dean Radin. Dean Radin's pretty good as far as he goes. His first couple books, I think one was called The Conscious Universe, and then there's another book by Richard Broughton. I believe it's just called Parapsychology. Might be a longer title, but all of these kind of those ones are basically, you can look to them for more introductions to all these phenomena. Carpenter's is the best analysis, or it's the best synthesis of them, because he actually comes up with a theory that puts all of the results together in something that makes sense, that coheres together in one whole. Whereas none of the other writers tend to do that. It's pretty much, here's all the different bits of evidence, but with no kind of overarching theory that puts them all together. But one of the bits of research that has come out from this endeavor is specifically in psychokinesis, is this idea of the mind affecting random processes, bringing order to random processes. So oftentimes in this kind of research, they'll use random number generators, and basically it's essentially a high-tech coin flip. And one of the principles of information and probability is that if you flip a coin, the more times you flip a coin, the less and less probable it is that you're going to continue to get heads. So you're not going to flip a million heads in a row. It's just not going to happen. And at a certain point, I don't know what the number is. I can't remember off the top of my head. But at a certain point, there's a number of flips where if you were flipping that coin for the entire duration or hypothesized duration of the entire universe, where you wouldn't get that number, past that number of flips. Like if you had billions of years of flipping like 10 times a second, then you might get randomly a stretch of however many heads in a row. But any more than that, it's beyond the probabilistic, how do they put it? It's beyond the probabilistic resources of the entire universe, basically. So what psychokinesis is, or demonstrates, is the ability of the mind to affect, essentially, probabilities, and to bring an order to randomness, or perceived randomness, that is out of the ordinary. So, for instance, in a digital coin flip, in a random number generator, or in variations of these types of experiments, you might have something where you expect a 50-50 probability. And with a good subject, or even all subjects combined and then analyzed at a kind of from a meta-analytic perspective, or in a meta-analysis, then you see that, a whole bunch of people or one individual gets like 51%, 52%, 53%. And at a certain point, the deviation from the expected 50% is way beyond chance. Like, billions to one or millions to one, where you wouldn't expect to see these results just if nothing was going on. That there does seem to be something going on. And because of the use of these random number generators, and I think some of these random number generators operate on quantum principles, but basically that makes more clear perhaps what is actually going on in psychokinesis, is that it is a transfer of information, or like a non-physical, like remote, non-local effect on random processes, but basically, or like I said before, bringing order to chaos. There is on that level, on that non-physical level, there is an effect, and that is essentially what people trying to understand the origin of life and the origin of DNA are looking for. Something that can take either a random mixture of chemical like components and put them together in an organized form that will then be life, essentially. What the origin of life is, I suspect, is a vastly improbable instantaneous quantum leap collection and amalgamation and ordering of the necessary raw materials, essentially. So the hypothesis is that just like intelligence is the only known cause of information, that psychokinesis would be the only known means of a mind creating that in the absence of a pre-existing physical form, essentially, because you need to, like I just said earlier, you can't just keep pushing the problem back of a physical form creating a physical form, because eventually you have to try to explain where the first physical form came from. But if we go back to our last show on where I read that bit from Rumi, if you take a more metaphysical approach, or an approach adopted by more and more philosophers these days, like a variation of one sort or another of panpsychism, then you can start with the idea that, well, matter itself isn't the fundamental constituent of the universe. Consciousness is at the root. Information is at the root. Information is at a level below the expression of information in the form of physics and chemistry. And to adopt the more mystical expression of it is that consciousness is at the root of everything, that mind is fundamental. So if mind is fundamental, then the means of ordering that basic raw chemistry would be an effect of the mind on the chemistry, on the raw materials, a direct influence, but a non-local influence. So what you would essentially be seeing in the formation of the first life is a psychokinetic effect on raw materials that then brings them into a vastly improbable form. This is why I like the image of the improbability drive from Hitchhiker's Guide, because it's silly and funny, but there's an idea there that is there's something to that idea. Mm-hmm. It might not be the improbability drive is in itself almost like a random process, and that's why it's funny, because it randomly creates vastly improbable things that would require intelligence in order to bring about. But because it's in the form of this inert improbability drive, it just makes the gag work. But for that to actually work, or a way of having that actually work would just be to have a superintelligence doing it. A superintelligence with a very refined psychokinetic ability.
Well, and that's...
Does that make sense?
Well, it does. It makes sense, and it's analogous to our own personal experience in life, is that you can see that there are exponential differences in intelligence between different species. You're out on the farm and you're domesticating cattle. You have cattle that is it has an intelligence and a form of sentience, but the human farmer has vastly more intelligence, and so they can engineer them and alter them in ways that are beneficial for humanity's survival. And it's theoretically plausible, I mean, just based on common sense and just deductions based on your own observations, that there's an intelligence exponentially greater than humanity that is capable of potentially of seeding life, within that furnace, as you said, and directing the growth in some way, potentially through, like you were discussing earlier, massive die-offs and massive changes, just like a conveyor belt. You've got you've got a team engineering all of the different acids, like, hey, okay, we want this, we want to create something that's like this, and you're like, oh, okay, it's this kind of gravity, it's this temperature, this and that, so okay, there's this, I'm thinking that how it's working is that there's some sort of psychokinetic interdimensional transfer of information, of organizing information that is injected into places like a comet's tail, or something like that, and
or an
through
impact
that window,
crater.
Through that window of opportunity that's inherent within that vastly random electromagnetic, extremely volatile environment, and then you can direct things and create things within that. And then, just through whatever law, whatever mechanism directs that towards a planet, it delivers the payload. And then from there, you get to see how well you designed all of this stuff, and it hits. And now these organisms are able to, so now they're going to take off. They're going to start doing their thing. And they do their thing. And then another payload drops off. And now you see the emergence of what we could call as, like the first intelligent life, or the first life forms that we would recognize as being of life. And then on, and then it can keep going, and then there's massive die-offs, It's like, well, this one didn't work and because, you know, it's egotistical and it creates just radically horrible like living situations for all of its, you know, fellow beings, and it's, you know, and then it, you know, destroys itself basically. So now we'll have to try again and try again. But there, like you discussed on last week's show, there's in the mind of this intelligence is this ideal. And the entire process of life that we see, you know, working its way up from, you know, just very simple plant and animal to human is like there's some ideal that's being striven for, and it might be to gain that kind of intelligence, that quantum jump that you were talking about, in order for that species to be able to do that itself, and then to also get to join in on the fun and the games of being, you know, caretakers or stewards of different life forms.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a couple of things that were brought up last week. I quoted, or I summarized a bit from John Bennett, his book Masters of Wisdom, and what you're talking about is this, the evidence of a kind of grand experimentation that's going on, that we are the experiment, that life on this planet is the experiment, and it is like the most complex and like wonderful and frightening and horrible and wonderful experiment imaginable, going on billions of years. And that for Bennett, he saw, for him it was just plain common sense. It was just, well, immediately evident upon looking at life and what we know of it is that there are signs of experimentation. What we see as the evolution of organisms, of species, and as these great die-offs and as these explosions of new body plans, what the Darwinist sees as this kind of random emergence of these new forms and the die-offs of them, is actually an experiment. It's actually a sign of experimentation, injecting new forms and new ideas and new life in order to see not only how it works, but if it achieves a certain goal. Oh, well, this life needs this now, or what would life be like with this new element involved? And the second idea that it reminds me of is that for this to happen, it requires a super intelligence. This isn't something that even any of the brightest minds of humanity could engage in, because, again, like Bennett pointed out, the systems are too complex. The system of interrelationships is extremely intricate, and the relationships go down to all levels. Like the relationships, like the only reason your body is able to function is because of this intricate interaction between all of these systems in your body, all of these cells. And when you get down to progressively through all these levels of the body to the very bottom, the amount of complexity, and the amount of stuff we don't even know about, which makes it even more complex, is just staggering. So there is signs that the only cause of this must have been, first of all, a super intelligence, and that it is experimenting, and that word itself might conjure up like nefarious ideas in listeners' minds. Oh, we're just an experiment? Well, no, we are an experiment doesn't have to be just sinister. An experiment, I mean, experiments can be for the purposes of discovery or of achieving great ends, or of just like curiosity on its highest level. It's the play of creation and the play of intelligence. And but there are both aspects to it, right? There is a terrible aspect to it of life itself, and there may even be a sinister aspect to the experimentation. We don't know who all of these super intelligences are, or if they're competing super intelligence with different agendas.
No, yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And as you're talking, I'm thinking of another analogy. As you're discussing all of the different forms that life takes and all these different little attempts to create new life forms and this and that. And there's something I think really remarkable about the different systems that are kept. You know, I don't know how many systems have been abandoned in the history of life on Earth, but in order to have an eyeball or a brain, or to be able to receive light waves and information and decode them and be able to read them and understand them and to be able to automatically react to them, to have stomachs. And then, from the very first stomach, then became the brain was, engineered, and it just kept going and going. There's all these different systems that you can see. Some are maybe haphazardly built on older systems, but it's because of just the sheer volatility, of life and all of these different things that are working together almost like too marvelously. It's like we are completely blind to the small miracles. I guess you could say engineering marvels of the simplest things, like the flagellum on the bacteria. But all of these different systems they're kept, and in humanity you see, who knows how many different codes, from different species, just like a little splice of that, a splice of this, splice of that, and voila, now you have a hairless, bipedal, loud, obnoxious, whatever, that's capable of, grasping and manipulating and creating for itself. And it's, I just can't help but think of the evolution of the automobile. From the old days, even before like Model Ts and, all of those, that, it's, you gotta work the windshield with your hand. You got to start it with a crank or whatever. There's just this ingenuity to create an engine that, is based on, this combustion engine. And that, then you take that and you're like, okay, we'll add some wheels onto this. We'll take the, the wagon design and we'll add some wheels onto this and see how that works. And then, you just flash forward through time, and now we're living in a world where cars are going to be driving us, pretty soon, because of the sheer ingenuity of vast number of researchers and engineers who design these things for. Some people like I don't need a car that can drive myself. I can't think of anybody who in their right mind would now want a car that drives itself. But I've seen how people drive, and I might be tempted to say that I would trust lots of cars more than most drivers, most human drivers. So there's you can see the evolution. You take these systems, okay, these things work. And now we can improve on this and we improve on that. And then more information comes in from related fields, from different minds who see the problem in new ways. It's like, okay, so now we could put a computer in there, and now the computer could actually tell the engine when to fire, so that now we can save gas and we can actually increase the power of an engine, because the computer is going to tell the spark plug that at this precise millisecond you should fire. And then that will increase the power of the engine, whatever, just tiny a bit. But you see this intelligence being put into the vehicle, and you see the change that the vehicle has made, and then you look at my car and you see what random mutation has done to it, and you're like, okay, yes, I'm completely done with that whole random mutation that kind of stuff. It's so clearly and obviously. It was a fad. It was respectable to be a Darwinist, because you say, I don't believe in God and this and that. And I understand why so many countless biologists, have taken it and ran with it, because it was respectable. It was fashionable at the time. But people, let's just get done. Let's just be done with it. The science is in. Get read up on the material and just get with the program, right? Let's put that beast to bed.
Well, I was just thinking about what you were talking about, Corey, and just the sheer complexity of all that is within an ecosystem. So there's the sheer amount of complexity within one system within itself. But then you're not just, when you look around you, you're not just looking at just one system or just one individual thing. We're not just And even then, like, there is no thing that is a thing unto itself. Like, each organism is dependent upon all of these other different organisms in a very real way, such as like the bacteria in your gut. So you can't even think of it in the way of like, one man being on the moon or something like that. It's totally impossible. Yeah. And so again, trying to come at it from that angle of a random mutation, you're not talking about just one creature. or one thing. This is so infinitely complex that it's utterly absurd. And then also what you were saying earlier, Harrison, about the inference to the best explanation. Well, I think that's a great approach, to just look at what's going on around you and try to infer from that, and based on that, what potential possibilities there are for why things are the way that they are. And the only logical conclusion then is that there is some kind of intelligence at work here. It could be nefarious, it could be beneficial, just like within the scientific communities as they exist today.
Right,
you have
and
some mad scientists.
Yes, and then take a look at your car, and as soon as you drove it off the lot, did it start to gain in value because of all the random mutations that started to happen to it? No, it's breaking down, and it's going to be in a junk heap within 10 years. But you look at the life forms that you see all around us, and you think, like you were saying, Harrison, this has been going on for billions and billions of years. This is not just random, haphazard stuff going on.
And I like the example of the car, the vehicle, because there's a principle there too. And there seems to be almost like universal laws or principles of creation, of intelligent design, or just design itself, because all design is intelligent. And that is that if you look at the car developed as almost like an accretion and intelligent mutation of the existing model. So you have your first car, the first guy that managed to put together a working vehicle, and then everything else is kind of based on that. No one totally reinvented the car. Well, if they did, it's a different vehicle. It's not known as a car, but every car we know of today and that we experience today is kind of traces its lineage back to those first cars that were developed, that first one car. Well, and to the idea of that car in the first car inventor's imagination. So you see a similar thing in life, as you were describing all these components and splicing in a little bit of this species and that species, is that each new creation is built on the model of the previous ones with some new stuff. It's like, okay, well, we've got this model. Well, how can we change it? Oh, well, let's take a little bit of that. Or I've got this idea, this new idea that isn't present in any of the other ones. What if I do that? But I was inspired by all these things because I realized that we're lacking, that all of these suggest a third possibility that doesn't exist yet. So let's try that third possibility. So you get all of this new stuff coming in too. And that's how we have the cars that we have today. It's all the new stuff that was added on to the old stuff, but using that first basic body plan, that first schematic of that first car. Everything kind of comes from that. And so you were talking about the systems that have been preserved throughout time, and one of them is the cell itself. It's like every organism is cell-based. It's kind of circular. Every cell-based organism is cell-based, but that is one component that is preserved entirely. And it's not like the cell shape itself, the cell form is not transmitted genetically. It's also a form of information, because if you think about it, you've got the cell with the genetic material in it. When you get a new organism, the cell splits. The cell shape itself is a direct descendant of the previous cell. It's not like the genetics, the DNA creates a new cell from nothing. You have this line of cells that goes back to the first cell. So you have this, again, that's kind of like this basic plan. That's one of the most fundamental shared characteristics among life is the cell body. And there are other things like there are other systems like that too that get preserved. So you have in every species too, you have genes that never change. You have certain body forms and body parts and body systems that never change. It's kind of like that necessary basic schematic that everything needs to be built on top of, because if you mess with any of the basic code, then the whole thing goes to hell. And some scientists, some research, like experiments have shown this. When they try to manipulate or like mutate a certain gene, it always leads to disaster, because that's one of those basic, most basic units that allows the organism to function at all. You can't change it. And that in itself is a kind of weird thing in Darwinism, because you'd think that anything could change, but there are some things that they can't change at all. They're very basic, very fundamental to the organism, and they're like certain parts of the car that have come down through the ages from the first prehistoric Ford. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us. I hope that you enjoyed, or we all hope that you enjoyed the show, and that we'll put a link to all of the relevant reading material below in the show description. But other than that, please join us again next week. And if you haven't already, please hit like and subscribe, share it wherever you share your social media stuff, and have a fantastic week and design intelligently. Bye-bye.